Pleasure to welcome all of you here, both those in the room and those joining us online, to this afternoon's event. It's a great pleasure to be co-hosting this event. I should say, for those of you who don't know me, that my name is Father Richard Finn, and I'm the director of the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice. And it's, as I say, a great pleasure to welcome you all here to Blackfriars Hall in the University of Oxford. And we're all participating here today in this event, Prayers and Stories of Peace, Religious Imaginaries and Victimhood Narratives in Colombia's Road to Peace. And this is co-hosted with Embrace Dialog, a transnational network of Colombians and friends of Colombia working to build an inclusive and comprehensive peace through the promotion of a culture of dialogue. And I'd like to thank Embrace Dialogue for their partnership in today's event. So let me very quickly present our two panelists this afternoon, both of whom have been working on DPhils here at Oxford, as well as working on peace building in Colombia, and who are strongly interested in exploring the stories we tell about ourselves and the world around us in times of war and peace. So let me say a tiny bit about each one of them. Alejandra Posada Teles is a doctoral candidate in international relations at St. Antony's College, Oxford, and a member of Embrace Dialogue. His research explores the intersection between the politics of victimhood and peace building. And it focuses on experiences of Colombia, Sri Lanka, Sierra Leone, and the United Kingdom in the aftermath of war. And our second panelist, Eduardo Gutierrez Gonzalez, is a doctoral candidate in science and religion. He's a JRF, a junior research fellow in humanities and social sciences here at Blackfriars Hall. And he's a member again of Embrace Dialogue. And his research seeks to contribute to peace building from theological and philosophical reflection. It focuses on the role of the imagination in the formation and transformation of beliefs, and in its use of the Colombian Truth Commission's report as a means to foster peace. Now, as I say, everyone, whether you're in the room or you're joining us online, we do really encourage all of you to participate in our conversation today. And after the two panelists have presented, there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. And for those of you who are online, perhaps you could contribute by logging your questions in the chat section of Zoom, so that we can then see them and then read out your questions and get your contribution that way. So I think I'm going to, at this point, hand over to Eduardo and Alejandro, and thank you both for taking part and leading us in this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Richard. For very generous words. Thank you all for being here and everybody who's logged online. I'm really happy to be back in Oxford here at Blackfriars. Like Father Richard said, this is basically a conversation among friends. So we both have a few ideas that we want to share with everyone here and online, but any comments, any questions, we're more than looking forward to that. What I'm going to do is basically offer a bird's eye view of what I've been doing as part of my doctoral research. And I framed it in terms of a situation that I want to address, right? There's a task to be done in the current political landscape in Colombia. And in that context, my thesis comes in as sort of an action in response to the political arena, right? And very briefly, sort of, I'm going to highlight the results of that. And again, if there's interest in anything, be it the process, the theoretical framework that I'm using, or the results, I'm more than happy to expand. And because this is a conversation among friends, I mean, Alejandro is also doing research here at Oxford, and we're both keen on discussing stories we tell about ourselves, just that we're coming from different backgrounds. I come from philosophy and theology, and I'm looking at religious imaginaries in Colombia. Alejo comes from international relations, and he's looking at victimhood narratives. But there is an overlap in as much as we're looking at how to better contribute to peace building in the country. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Right. Situation, the historical background. Colombia has been at war for decades, and after many efforts and governments trying to make peace in different ways, a peace agreement was finally signed back in 2016 between the government and the biggest guerrilla group that we had back in the day called the FARC, right? Since then, there's been many challenges, ongoing difficulties in both implementing what was agreed, right, on both sides, but also, and even more deeply, I would say, to engage with the cultural challenges that such a transformation entails, right? Having a whole society deep in war for so many decades alters not just the structures and the infrastructure and the institutions, but also people's minds and our approach to the world. And so shifting from one mindset to the other is a challenge in and of itself. Part of the landscape, once the peace was signed between FARC and the government, was we deployed a transitional justice mechanism to help the country in the process. For those of you who don't know, a transitional justice system includes a set of institutions that enable a country that has been either at war and isn't anymore, or was a colony and is not anymore, was just starting to experience democracy as a system, to go through the process, right? And a typical transitional justice would include something like a truth commission or a truth and reconciliation commission, a group of people that work for a series of years trying to make sure that a narrative is arrived. I mean, you get a narrative that allows everyone to understand what happened and to ensure that everything that was the difficulties that the country went through doesn't happen again, sort of ensure that there is a lasting peace in the country. I'm interested in the Colombian Truth Commission and the report. I mean, after many years and, well, not many years, a few years, a Leviathan was written down. It was more than 6,000 pages, 11 volumes. It was massive. And at the heart of that report, there is a specific volume called Findings and Recommendations, which is not supposed to be a summary, but it lies at the heart of it all. And it does aim to signal key aspects of what happened in the past and what the Truth Commission is suggesting that we do to ensure peace in the future. Now, I'm bringing it up because amongst the many things that this volume discusses, there is much talk about cultural reform and cultural transformation. And within that section of the text, there's much talk about imaginaries. So I was reading the text and I thought, well, what are these social imaginaries that the text is referring to? And I was particularly keen to understand the role that religious imaginaries played within the story in Colombia. What to do about this? Why is it interesting? There were many questions that were starting to arise. And so what I thought was, well, let's try to come up with a conceptual apparatus, right? A theory that would enable a critical reading of the report's imaginaries, that it would allow us to facilitate ongoing efforts to implement those cultural related recommendations and help us with the religious based imaginaries as well. Why is this relevant? I think in many transitional justice scenarios and many peace building and conflict resolution efforts, there is much to be said in terms of public policy, in terms of government and state-based initiatives. But sometimes civil society is not there as much or as strongly as it should, I believe. And even though it is on the side of the government, it is the government's and the state's responsibility to ensure that civil society has the guarantees and the space in order to act. A very interesting in the case of Colombia has been there is a number of civil society initiatives all around, and it's been happening even before peace was starting to be negotiated. And so in a sense, I'm interested in those recommendations that need to be taken up, supported by government and state and public policy, but don't necessarily have to do with reform or with reparation. It has to do more with what communities of faith can do to help out in the process, right? Another interesting thing about my project is a typical effort would have been to look at law or political science, but I decided to look elsewhere in order to come up with this apparatus. I was looking into philosophy and theology because there is a very interesting tradition of what these social imaginaries are. There's a number of ways to understand them. If someone here doesn't know what an imaginary is, what I'm referring to is these are structures of the mind, right? Some talk about affectively laden thought patterns. A different way of explaining this would be, you can talk about someone's opinions, you can talk about someone's cosmovision, you can talk about someone's approach to the world, but philosophically, each of these concepts introduces nuances and details and accents. When you talk and when we talk about imaginaries, we're highlighting the fact that our approach to the world is contingent. It can change. It's not necessary. It's not rigid. And it has a quota of creativity. And so when you look at a political scenario like the one we're going through in Colombia, looking at other people's understanding of the country, of what our past entails, of violence, of peace, phrasing it in terms of imaginaries complexifies things and allows us to broaden perspectives. Allow me for examples. If I say here, if I talk about Brexit, or if I talk about, say, Margaret Thatcher, or for the Colombians, if I say President Uribe or peace agreement, what I say might resonate within you in a number of ways. You might understand or might not understand what I'm talking about, but I suspect that alongside a comprehension, a conceptual approach to the words that I've just said, there was also feelings and emotions elicited. Some people might praise Margaret Thatcher for what she did. Some people might not. President Uribe has people that love him throughout the country, and some people hate him. And so as soon as you say President Uribe, it's not just an aseptic concept that we're discussing. There is a number of emotional charges behind it. And alongside not just that, but also the development of individual and community identities, and even a correlation between that and social practices. When you weave all of those things together, you are no longer discussing concepts, you are discussing imaginaries. And although it might sound like a philosophical headache, when it comes to peace building, I believe that that complexifies and enriches the situation. It opens up a palette, right? A spectrum of possibilities and of tools that you can have at hand. I came up with an idea of how our imagination creates, forms, and transforms these imaginaries. I gave it a name. I called it the cosmopoietic imagination. So the world building imagination, right? And I very briefly came up with a threefold challenge when it comes to the transformation of imaginaries. How do social imaginaries form and transform? The threefold challenge would be: they are visualized, they are assessed, and they are adapted. Now, it's not a formula, it's not a rigid itinerary, but there are angles of the process that I believe should be taken into account if one is to understand how this takes place, both in an individual level, but also in terms of a country or a group of people. I won't go into detail. I will if someone asks me a question. But I would like to very briefly highlight the things that I found in terms of religious imaginaries in the country. And I think that might be the most interesting thing that we could discuss, both the structure or the architecture that I've just described, but also its application. Visualizing, assessing, and adapting. Why those three? The need to visualize comes because imaginaries are part of our approach to the world. They're a vital part of human experience, but we're not always aware of them. It's like the glasses that I'm wearing. If I want to describe my glasses, I better take them off and look at them. And sometimes we do see the world through lenses that we're not aware of. So the first key step is to visualize those imaginaries. In the case of Colombia, I think the report is very, very nuanced and rigorous when it comes to portraying the complex array of imaginaries that we have at hand. Focusing on what I would call ecclesiastical imaginaries, or the way churches and communities of faith are envisioned. There are positive approaches, there are negative approaches, and there are victimized approaches. In other words, in the complex history of Colombia, when you look at peace building and conflict resolution, communities of faith have been perpetrators. They have been victims, and they have been a very important part of the peace building initiatives. So they have presence throughout the whole spectrum. Now, there are some issues, I believe, in the way the report does this. There is some form of a historical caricature. It seems that for the report, communities of faith were evil before the 60s, full stop. And then after the 60s, they're part of the answer. I'm caricaturizing the caricature, but there is a strong tendency to look at it like that. And I do believe the situation is far more complex. I would phrase it not in terms of a clash between two historical periods, but a clash between two imaginaries. And this is useful because it allows us to understand that even within communities of faith today, there are very useful, peaceable ideas and imaginaries, but we still have warring mindsets that we need to address. In that sense, the first pending task would be ask ourselves, are those cultural practices still there? Do we have those subjacent imaginaries active or not? Regarding the assessment of those imaginaries, when we've seen those lenses, the real question would be, well, are they good? Are they bad? Are they desirable? Are they not? Are they moving in the line of peace as a project or not? The Truth Commission, am I doing good? We're okay with time? Couple minutes. Okay, I'll be quick about it. Regarding the assessment, I think the report has a very clear agenda. It does talk about peace. Within peace, it talks about the need for cultural transformation. When it looks at cultural transformation, it seeks to develop a secular ethics and a more inclusive democracy. That's really important. And among the many things that are needed and required to do that, the report identifies what it calls a set of devices of cultural re-addition, institutions and groups that are particularly relevant for the formation and transformation of our culture. It includes the media, it includes governmental communications, but it also includes communities of faith. And I think that's very meaningful. The conflict in Colombia is not fundamentally religious. And yet it is interesting to see that religious approaches, imaginaries, vocabularies are constantly popping up on all ends of the political spectrum, and both for peace and for war. So this is why I think the question is relevant. The issue is, I think the criteria that are used to assess those imaginaries in the report are not necessarily shared by all. If I speak with a group of people, if I talk to a group of people and tell them, say, you're not being inclusive enough, you're not being democratic enough, if they are part of a very specific portion of the political spectrum, they might agree. But if they don't, not only will my assessment not echo, but it simply will not be relevant. I'm not even opening a conversation. So a key aspect that I believe is a pending task that we have is, at least when it comes to communities of faith, to develop a greater philosophical and theological literacy. You need to understand the language with which communities of faith work and transform their lives. Address the fractures within the communities of faith, not because I tend to, this is not about having a homogeneous religious crowd in Colombia, but it is about avoiding violent chiasms and reactions as a response, of course. And then finally, translating somehow the Truth Commission's report and the project into theologically meaningful terms. I think this hasn't been done. And then finally, and I will close and hand over the floor. We have seen a set of imaginaries. We've assessed them. How do we adapt them? I believe that a key tool that we can use is what I call platforms of coincidence. Spaces, and by spaces, I am being very generous and ambiguous with the term. This is a platform of coincidence. If one of you is reading a book at night, that might be a platform of coincidence. If it is a space where different forms of imaginaries come together and people are genuinely open to the possibility of those imaginaries to resonate within. And so the Truth Commission's report by itself, I believe, is a very thin platform of coincidence. However, it is interesting that if you look at it in context, it has already begun catalyzing a set of initiatives throughout the country that I think are really, really valuable. And so in terms of adaptation, I would say the key aspect would be strengthening the existing platforms of coincidence that we already have, with churches, with inter-ecclesiastical associations, right? But also inaugurate or re-inaugurate platforms of coincidence, especially between those religious imaginaries that don't talk between themselves. There are three that I believe are particularly powerful. One would be art. I believe the arts have a key role to play. The Commission has been very, very keen on insisting that artistic translations of imaginaries are important in the reappropriation of these categories. Theological dialogue, so literally opening up a conversation between people from different sides or poles of the theological spectrum. And then finally, within Catholic circles, there's been much talk about synodality, the need to understand or reinterpret the way decisions are made, discernments, theological discernments are carried out, and the role of local churches alongside Rome and the Pope and the bishops. And so I think it's a very useful category theologically, but in the case of Colombia, it could be a door that we could open for a much more efficient transformation of our imaginaries. I've said a lot of stuff. I'm really sorry. I've tried to be as synthetic as possible. But again, if there's anything that I've said that seems interesting or resonates, I'll be very, very interesting to hear. And over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Eduardo. I love these kinds of spaces because they get different kinds of people with very different profiles to talk to each other, which is something difficult, especially in decentralized environments like Oxford. This is a heavily theological, philosophical exploration. I'm a political scientist, so I do really enjoy learning about it. And it speaks to very different dynamics to the ones I do. But one of the commonalities that I found here in what you just said was communities of faith being political actors, communities of faith being peace-building agents, communities of faith being victims and being perpetrators of violence. And that's the way I want to tie it into the kind of work I do, because what I do, and I'll tell you a small story about how I got into this topic in the first place. Once speaking to a lawyer in Colombia, they told me, oh, you know, I'm representing a group of families of the FARC, the insurgent group that demobilized in 2016. It's a very difficult situation for them because usually in their territories, they've been stigmatized. They have suffered direct forms of violence. In many cases, they've been killed, or they've just had to displace themselves, move out somewhere else because of a threat of violence being inflicted on them. Wow, horrible. And you don't tend to think about the families of insurgents. And then, yeah, well, he said, yeah, even more difficult because they don't get to qualify as victims according to the Colombian legal standards. And I found that striking. I found it shocking that not only do you suffer so much from the conflict, but you're not entitled to access this victim status that gives you a sort of, legally, if you're recognized as a victim in Colombia, you're entitled to certain benefits, certain, you're entitled to truth, justice, reparation, guarantees of non-repetition. Usually the reparation will be financial. But if you're a family member of an insurgent, you're not able to access that. That made me think about, who decides who's a victim, who is a legitimate victim of conflict, and who gets to decide that. And one of the reasons why I love this kind of conversation as well is because we're talking about transitional justice. And in the case of Colombia, and in the case of so many other countries around the world that have experienced violent conflict, it is the transitional justice mechanisms that decide who is a legitimate victim and who isn't a legitimate victim. And these, of course, are not value neutral categories. They are absolutely political, and they're politically charged, and they are, they follow certain interests based on the people who design these kinds of mechanisms, usually the state. So what I do in my research is I complicate this very binary dichotomies between victim and perpetrator. And I explore what I call narratives of victimhood, or how societies make sense of their victims. And I interpret them as powerful political instruments that are deployed and used as a tool by state actors to advance their account of what the conflict was about, which is what I call the meta conflict. So the conflict about the conflict. Because of course, when you tell the world that someone is a victim and someone else is a perpetrator, you're telling the story about what the conflict was about, who was in the right side, who was in the wrong side. And they're terribly absolute. And they also include other kinds of binaries within them. So it's not just the victim or the perpetrator, bless you, but it's also the innocent and the guilty. It's also the good and the evil. It's the right and wrong. And these are terribly reductive and binary logics that war pushes us to think. So what I'm trying to do in my research is precisely challenge. And I'm going to give you a few examples of what this looks like in practice, in the Colombian case at least. I look at 4 different cases. Today I'm going to focus on the Colombian one. The first time that Colombia experienced a serious mechanism of transitional justice was in 2005 with the Law of Justice and Peace. It was an effort by the Uribe government back then to demobilize the paramilitary groups that had been, in a constant struggle against guerrilla movements, and usually in alliance with state military. Back then, the actual legal definition of what being a victim was an individual who had been collectively or individually harmed by the actions of an illegal armed group. Which, if you think about it, it excludes a lot of different people that might have suffered from the conflict, but they're just not in there. But that's not, that's a political choice that is made. Why do we care about people who were victimized by illegal armed groups, but not by people who were victimized by the state or by paramilitary actors in alliance with the state? So me, if I had been victimized by a paramilitary group or by the FARC or by the ELN, generally insurgent groups, I could come in and tell the unit for victims, look, I've been victimized, this happened to me. But if I had been a victim of state crimes, I had no right to do so. So what this kind of notion of victimhood tried to do was sanitize the state crimes and just evade accountability for the state and its crimes. And it was also a central mechanism in which for the government to deny that an armed conflict existed. Because when you tell the story of these victims of illegal armed groups, you're essentially saying there is no armed conflict, but rather you've got a problem with illegal armed groups and the terrorist activity that they engage in. But there's no give and take. We're just trying to battle terrorism. This only changed in 2011 under the Santos government, a few months before the negotiations with the FARC started. Santos said, the time has come for the Colombian state to recognize that there has been an armed conflict in Colombia for 60 years, or 50 years back then. And we have to recognize that many different people were victimized during this time, and many people experienced suffering. And we cannot constrain suffering to those people who suffered during because of the actions of illegal armed groups. So he enacts the victims law, the 2011 victims law, that again recognizes that there was an armed conflict and opens up the recognition of victims to victims of the guerrillas, of other illegal armed groups, of paramilitaries, and of state actors, crucially, which was the biggest change that took place in 2011. That framework was drawn by the 2016 transitional justice system, which is composed by the Truth Commission, as Eduardo was talking about. It's composed of a special jurisdiction for peace, essentially special courts to try war crimes and to give amnesties to people who did not commit war crimes, and a unit for the search of disappeared people. So what I do is I essentially look at how victims are represented in these mechanisms, and what I find is that these the 2016 mechanisms have, especially the Truth Commission, have a very inclusive and plural notion of who a legitimate victim is, and recognizes the variety of experiences of violence during this time, and also of perpetrators, based on this benchmark of who a victim is. The Truth Commission in particular, I'd like to speak a little bit to it, was central to constructing a plural account of what the conflict was about and of the violence experienced by different people. It rejects linear, simplistic narratives or accounts about what the conflict was and about its victims. You mentioned it a little bit. You say that it doesn't push us far enough. Well, the way I see it is that
I'll clarify.
Yeah, fair. But what I do want to highlight is that it spotlights the suffering of indigenous groups, of women, of LGBTQ plus communities, of children, talks about victims of guerrillas, of the state, of paramilitary actors. And also it does something I really admire about it, is that it brings in the stories of insurgents. And it tells the stories of insurgents as humans, people who had a particular motivation to join an insurgent group, people who suffered violence at the hands of the state and paramilitary actors, and whose families suffered quite a bit. And it also emphasizes their political participation in the post-2016 period, which I think is fantastic, because for the first time in Colombian history, we have a mechanism that is actually humanizing this enemy other that we always thought was this evil perpetrator of violence just because they were an insurgent. So that, I think, is the biggest way that it crafts a plural and inclusive narrative of what being a victim looks like. The complication to that, though, is that it is able to do it because it is a non-legal mechanism. The legal element is much more complicated, and it follows some principles of international law, of amnesties, the types of amnesty that may be given. And legally, insurgents and their families are still not entitled to a victim status. So what I want to say is that there's still victim hierarchies in Colombia. They haven't gone. They're still very much there. And some experiences of violence are still being privileged over others. But the Truth Commission and these other mechanisms of transitional justice, I find, have done a fantastic job in amplifying the ideas, the imaginaries, and the representations of who victims are, or at least legitimate victims are. In my opinion, it's constructive for peace, because it breaks down the stiff categories and hierarchies. It, of course, humanizes that enemy other, and it supports the production of complex narratives about what the conflict was about. It challenges this linear, simplistic, binary logics of war. Just briefly, as a point of conclusion, the takeaway here is that victimhood is not a neutral, it's not a legal, or it's not a public policy category, but it's a powerful political tool that helps certain actors tell certain stories about the conflict. And we can talk a little bit more about it in a moment. I think that's my time.
Amazing.
Good.
Well done. So I have a few things to comment and then questions to fire away. I love the way you phrased the whole relationship between communities of faith and political actors, and when you asked like who decides, I think that was a very interesting question to ask, because if you're moving within legal frameworks and you're trying to understand, okay, what are those narratives that we tell about ourselves and about our victims? Well, technically speaking, there's a huge chunk of it that does depend on lawyers and the state and government. And however, if you look at it from a cultural perspective, it's not just them. Like, there is a way in which we get to decide what are those stories. And I think that sort of empowering civil society is a part of an important part of the whole agenda, which the Truth Commission's report itself also puts forward. So I think that's also, adding to your list of nice things about the report. I would definitely add that.
Actually, if I might just ask something about that in the context of your research.
Sure.
I mean, you talk quite a bit in the context of communities of faith about cultural transformation, of course. But in the same way that, I mean, legally you can see how many victims have been recognized as a victim, or how many people are entitled to compensation for the suffering that they've had. You can measure these kinds of things. Cultural transformation is very thorny. It's very complex and just difficult to conceptualize at the end of the day. So I want to hear a little more about you, about how we might go about this beyond, the top-down Truth Commission finding that cultural transformations are necessary. What kinds of spaces do we need to promote cultural transformations? What kinds of conversations do we need to be having? Can we replicate this at the macro level, or is it just possible to do in small settings?
That's a tough question. That was a question
Sorry.
I was going to ask you.
Got there first.
What do you think? No, I'm kidding. No, I think it's a tough question. I do think it's I mean, and it's not just a tough question for me right now. It's a tough question that the country is trying to address at the moment. Like I've spoken to people at the president's office, and they are really trying to understand how could they visualize, assess, quantify whether or not these measures have been taken, whether or not the recommendations have been implemented. But once again, I think a key aspect of it all will be to diversify the number of people discussing these issues and opening up new spaces and new languages for those discussions. On the one hand, I once again believe that public policy needs to protect and ensure the space for civil society to do what it has to do. But once that space is given and ensured, I think it's up to us, as in civilians, to engage in a conversation. And that conversation does not necessarily have to be legal, as in legal terms. I don't want illegal conversations, whatever that means.
Is religion a language?
Of course, definitely. It's a space for a number of languages to come together. And that's the magic of it, I think. In my opinion, at least, phrasing the whole endeavor in terms of imaginaries prevents us from sort of oversimplifying the whole affair as if it were a clash between believers and non-believers, or Catholics and Protestants, or which might be the case in different latitudes. But at least in Colombia, I don't know, 70% of the country, give or take, is either Catholic or self-identifies as Catholic or has a strong influence over the Catholic Church. 20-ish% is still Protestant, and then there's a 10% of other forms of belief. And so I think for everyone, it is undeniable that there is a strong Christian Catholic influx in the culture. And so diversifying the number of ways in which that particular cultural force is appropriated and reappropriated by different people, I think is key. And so, yes, I think it's about diversifying spaces. It's about understanding the different forms of languages. And again, echoing what I was saying about the platforms of coincidence, I think there are different formats that could be used. We already have conversations taking place between different communities of faith. Just we need to diversify. Yeah.
I'd like to come in at this point with a question from one of our online participants, Charles Beach. Charles says this is a question primarily for Eduardo. Do you think there's a secular bias amongst peace process practitioners and academics that leads to religious imaginaries and faith not being taken seriously or understood?
That's a great question. I think that could definitely be the case sometimes. When you look at the Truth Commission's report, yes, religion does not come up as a key frontline ingredient, if you will, in the discussions. And it is interesting to note that the president of the Truth Commission back in the day, Francisco Eru, who's a Jesuit, wrote a clarification that was included in part of the report, as part of the report. And at one point, he did say that he explicitly avoided deepening into Christian in general and Catholic in particular contributions to peace, because he was trying to make sure that it wasn't read as a propaganda effort on his behalf, being a priest himself, because he didn't want to cast a shadow over other Christian denominations and even other forms of religion in general. And I think there's a lot to be said in terms of people being wary of, cautious about the intermingling of religion and politics. And I have to admit that they have a bit of reason on their end. But the good thing I would say is, if you look at the report, once again, the visualization of imaginaries is quite broad. And so if you're fair, you would have to say, yes, there have been times when religion has had a sad cultural consequence in the country, but there's many others where that has not been the case. And even though there might be a bias, and I know what Charles is referring to, I would also highlight the fact that the report aims to bet or gamble towards peace being something important for communities of faith. As in, the final suggestion of it all would be communities of faith can be our allies in these peace building and conflict resolution efforts. And so my thesis, in a sense, aims to help in that line.
Alejandro, anything you would want to comment on that? Otherwise, I have a question.
I
I think
do.
is primarily aimed at you.
Yeah.
So
Okay, I'll just make a very brief comment about the relationship between religion and politics when it comes to transitional justice. Transitional justice has a very Western neoliberal paradigmatic foundation. I would say there's a right way to do transitional justice. It's grounded in international law. The main actors promoting it are usually Western countries, the United Nations, the ICC is very heavily involved. And the reality is that these countries, and especially these big institutions like the UN, they struggle to deal with religion because they see themselves as cosmopolitan, secular, as Charles just said. And what the outcome of that is that they stop seeing religion as a political instrument. They depoliticize religion, and with that, they assume that if there is a religious element to be dealt in the conflict, it needs to be dealt with by particular religious communities. We do not get involved in there because religion is not political. Religion is just religious.
okay, the question I think which is primarily directed towards you to start with on victim narratives. What's distinct? This is Carol Grobicki asking, what's distinctive about victimhood in Colombia? Is the experience there comparable to similar processes that have taken place in other countries?
Yes, Carol, thank you for your question. So that gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the other cases that I work on. I'll just mention them very, very briefly. Different governments have used the different mechanisms of transitional justice in different ways and for different purposes. So a case that I think of that very radically different to the Colombian one is the Sri Lankan case. In 2009, amidst allegations of genocidal dynamics happening in northern Sri Lanka, particularly against the Tamil population, a truth commission was established that essentially said we are just fighting a problem of terrorism and the state has done nothing wrong here. When the evidence that circulated was that, again, there were some heavily genocidal dynamics and widespread human rights violations. In that case in particular, the definition of victimhood or the way victims were represented was extremely narrow and was reserved for Sinhalese individuals who had been victimized by the Tamil terrorist groups. A bit like the Justice and Law piece in Colombia in 2005, same exact dynamic. But then you also have different ways of doing things, like here in the UK, in Northern Ireland, there's been a policy of strategic silence around who is guilty and who is a victim. And the way that the architects of the Good Friday Agreement have thought about this is, it's better if we just let people have their narratives, and if we start digging into the past, they're going to end up clashing, and that's going to ruin our fragile peace, but peace nonetheless, or at least a negative peace. So that particular policy of strategic silence, we might be able to debate for hours whether it's conducive towards lasting peace or whether the only way to actually reach a stable peace is to dig around the past and really come to terms with what happened, just to offer justice, truth, and reparations to people who have been victimized, or if we should just not rummage in too much to avoid messing up with the dynamics that have been established.
We have one more question waiting in the chat at the moment, but are there any questions from people who are in the room to feed into the mix at this stage?
Or thoughts?
Yeah.
Or comments, yes. I have a few things to say, but I'd like to have someone from the room talk.
Please.
One question I have to mind is how you perceive the relation between peace and justice in general, where you consider there is a positive relation between the two, whether justice is just a prerequisite, whether justice is enough for peace, and also if there is a role in reconciliation with this, perhaps after justice, the concept of reconciliation coming in, and whether this is something that can apply to Colombia.
Do you want me to say something about that? No, that's a fantastic question. The first thing that I'll say is that whenever conflict ends, or the bulk of violence of a conflict ends, a number of people have to get together to decide, okay,
What are we going to do?
what are we going to do? What does the future look like for us? Are we going to reckon with the past? Are we going to, build a future including this individuals and this other individuals? So it's a hyper political period where lots of difficult decisions have to be made. One of them, as you said, is, are we going to prioritize justice or are we going to prioritize peace? Because if we prioritize justice, we might not be having people demobilize if we're striving for a peace agreement at least. But if you prioritize too much peace, then you've got, no accountability. And that is the kind of logic that dominates our thinking of transitional justice nowadays. But I'm going to tell you, my own thinking on that is that justice works with constrained narratives. And that those kinds of debates, they imply a sense of closure, that we need to be striving for closure of those debates of the past, and we need to be moving forward. And that for me it's a bad goal. It's a bad goal because it means squashing, it means killing certain narratives if you're striving for closure. I had some notes on that actually that I can't seem to find them right now. But essentially,
I could add something if you want.
yeah, sorry, just 1 second. I do want to say something about the element of closure, because closure also implies a sense of legality. And Eduardo was articulating it in a very good way before, about how we tend to think of peace within this technocratic, legalistic, or hyper-legalistic frameworks that are based on law, that are based on public policy. And I would say we have to think beyond those. We have to think about transitional justice being a tool for dialogue, for negotiation, for democratic negotiation and contestation about the past, but also about the peace in the future. Because different people understand peace in different ways. So maybe if we think beyond this technocratic neoliberal frames for transitional justice, we might be able to see something beyond that goal of closure. And as Robert Cover, actually a sociolegal scholar, and with this I'll close, he talks about the juryopathic nature of transitional justice, and he criticizes that. He says these are bad goals.
I would add two things on that line. One would be, there's a well-known scholar called John Paul Lederer who talks about just peace, and he sort of crafted this sort of neologism to describe how there's an intrinsic relationship between those two. So there's much talk about both of them being sort of two sides of a coin. You can't have one without the other. That's one thing to bear in mind. Another one might be, well, in philosophy, at least if you move in Aristotle's line, you would say things are said in different ways. I'm destroying the Greek there, but basically you can talk about justice in a number of ways. And I think that even within philosophical circles, there's much talk about reparative justice,
restorative justice.
Yeah, translating restorative justice, which is justice, but it's a different kind of justice nonetheless. So comment number two. And comment number three would be, you mentioned reconciliation, and I do think that's a very powerful, not always, but strongly religiously laden concept. And in that sense, I believe that communities of faith have a role to play in general, but at least in Colombia in particular. When you think about religious imaginaries, they tend to be very grounding imaginaries in people's ecosystems of imaginary forms. And so touching upon someone's understanding of who God is, their spiritual life, and the consequences that has in the world is deeply, deeply powerful. And so I believe when the time comes, not in a negative peace line of effort, as in avoiding conflict and solving the gunfire, but also positive peace, I think reconciliation comes in, and I think that's an important task. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Mariana Pinson Cajedo, who's really asking about the relationship between political parties and imaginaries. Do political parties enforce local imaginaries? Are political parties creating these imaginaries? Where do the parties come into the mix?
Should I mean, I think that's a very complex, thank you, is that Mariana?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think imaginaries can be developed in a number of levels. And so one of the key aspects of dwelling in imaginary transformation is to have clarity in terms of the epistemic level that we're discussing. Are we talking about a country's imaginary? Are we talking about a region's imaginary? Are we talking about a church's imaginary? Parties have played a very, very important role in the history of the country. And I think in terms of the relationship with churches, for example, one of the key elements that is brought up by the report is how at one point a considerable, like an important faction of the Catholic Church was on the Conservative Party side and very much against the Liberal Party side. And in fact, there were a number of very, very violent discourses against liberals and communists as well. Things are far more complex nowadays. You don't have just liberals and conservatives. You have a number of parties that are different. But yes, I would say that political parties are an important stance, one among many that should be taken into consideration when the conversation begins.
Alejandro, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just a brief comment on political leaders are generally very, very important in mobilizing identitarian elements. Could be religious, could be ethnic, racial, could be ideological, as it is. But just to respond to Mariana, specifically on political parties, I would really agree with Eduardo. In the last 60 years, we've had a strong influence in Colombia of political parties, and they, you would go to war for your political party. Nowadays, every time someone disagrees with someone else, they just go in and they file to create another political party. They're like, no, this is just our new party, and nowadays we're the country in Latin America with the most number of political parties is Colombia. So the relevance of political parties, at least in the Colombian context, has really diminished because they do not prompt such sectarian views as they used to in the past. I remember my grandfather telling me stories about about the period of La Violencia in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. People would literally stop talking to each other if they had an affiliation or just a conviction for the stances of one of the political parties. And this is what happens in bipartisan kind of contexts where you either belong here or you belong here. Again, back to what I've been saying since the beginning, conflict and war generally pushes to think in binaries. So you're either a liberal or you're a conservative. But nowadays, political parties, they've become a bit of a...
I mean, on the one hand, I would say it's a democratically healthy dynamic, but on the other hand, it does mean that they are not as relevant, at least not as they were back in the day. But yeah, I think there's a common trope in the conversation here, which is the need to complexify, the need to broaden perspectives, the need to question stories, be them religious or victimhood or otherwise, but then also the need to humanize whoever is different. So if I don't agree with you because you're not part of my church, you're not part of my party, that's sort of the way that othering is carried out, and whether or not there's violence there, I think that's a key aspect that needs revision.
Okay, can I ask if there's another question from the floor? Yes?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. So Alejandro talked about like a strategic silence, but in the case of Colombia, I can think of like, I would say deliberative deafness, like many sectors of the society, political parties. I could think of Centro Democrático, even Duque, who didn't go to the event of the presentation of the report, deliberately don't listen to what the report has to say and to the narratives that the transitional justice system has brought about. So
how do we
with that? And especially my main concern is about we are risking effectiveness. I mean, we have 16 volumes of the report, but we risk of that being like just letters, just some books in the shelves, no repercussion in the real world, no changes. So that's, in my opinion, something which is at stake. And of course, like there are many recommendations, and I agree with everything you've said, but I'm like, how can we make that like, and I wouldn't say enforced, but how can that make a real change? Because usually, sometimes the Truth Commission might seem to some people very like biased. At least like one commissioner like just resigned, for example, in the military. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think that's one of the pending tasks that we have, and it's one of the most dear to my heart. Like, I've seen a number of initiatives throughout the country, and there's much effort in terms of getting the victims together with their perpetrators, getting the Truth Commission with a number of sectors. But I do still think there's much to be done in terms of reaching those who do not agree with the Truth Commission, with the peace agreement, with the report, and even with the next peace process that we're currently working on in the country as well. So the kind of dialogue that entails, some people talk about improbable dialogues. I mean, it's very easy to talk with people that think like you. The real tough thing is, well, how about sitting down and talking to those that are different? And I think you'll remember we had Luca here a while ago, a few months ago, I think. And I mean, I can plainly say I don't like Luca, I don't like his government, I didn't agree with many of the things he did or said, but I managed to sit down and talk to him, and it was really tough. But I thought, well, this is the kind of thing that needs to be done. And again, because the panorama is so complex, I think everyone needs to contribute from their stance. And so in my case, at least, it's well, I'm an academic. I have a particular interest in theology and spirituality and communities of faith. Well, maybe I can help in that specific province. And it is about engaging in those difficult, tough conversations. There is no recipe, but I have hints and pieces and tips, so we can talk about it later if you want. But that would be my response.
If I can feed in now another question from our online participants. This is from Juliana Ramirez. She has a couple of questions, really, primarily directed, Eduardo, towards you. One is to say something about how you see platforms of coincidence working in everyday urban contexts. Urban contexts, yeah, especially those less affected by conflict. And what do you see the role of families there? And then she also asked, could you say a bit more about the cosmopoetic imagination?
I think we all want to know more about that.
That was nice of her to add. Families and platforms of coincidence. Wow, I haven't thought of that in those terms. I'll say this. There is another scholar in Colombia, I forget his name, from Universidad Nacional, who's been working for many, many years now on urban imaginaries. And not only in theory, he's come up with a series of projects to talk about Rio reimagined, New York reimagined, Paris reimagined, Bogota reimagined. So he has a number of very, very interesting ideas of how urban imaginaries are developed and how they form and transform, how they change. So that might be one thing worth looking at, Juliana. I think platforms of coincidence are multi-formed, like they're plural, they're varied, there's a spectrum. And so, yeah, families are definitely a very, very important one. I think depending on the regional cultures in the country, families have a role to play, and they're different kinds of roles. But yes, definitely. I mean, and not just families, I would add the relationship between families and the educational system. I think that's a key link that needs to be worked on. And in fact, there is already a lot of people looking at that right now. And then finally, about the cosmopoetic imagination, what can I say? The story behind it is I realized that there were many theories about the structure of imaginaries, but I was not happy with ideas of how they form and transform. And I said, well, maybe I can come up with an idea myself. And so I took up Kathleen Lennon's understanding of social imaginaries. She's a British professor. She just retired from Hull University. Strongly Kantian, there's a lot of phenomenology, psychoanalysis. She has a very, very rich matrix, a philosophical matrix to talk about what imaginaries are. But then I thought I want to talk about my own experience as well. And so I drew a set of parallels between the way imagination is used in different disciplines. So I looked at fantastic literature, I looked at science and religion, I looked at peace building and conflict resolution. I looked at theoretical physics, and I chose a set of authors that were not only relevant in their fields, but they were also particularly creative and explicit about the role imagination played in their own craft. And by drawing those parallels, being mindful of the differences, I thought, well, I do see a common structure that might help in this process of visualizing, assessing, and adapting. And that's how I came up with the whole idea of the cosmopoietic imagination, which is a fancy word to talk about this sort of umbrella concept to include the scientific imagination, the literary imagination, the religious imagination. It's my way of saying human beings have an innate capability, a skill to come up with maps to locate themselves in the world and make sense of their experience of it.
Alejandro, would you like to comment?
Yeah, Juliana mentioned urban contexts, which makes me feel like it's important to tie it to Nicolas's question. Who does a Truth Commission report belong to? Who takes ownership of it? If we think that the only way in which a Truth Commission report or a series of recommendations of a Truth Commission will influence or have a real impact in the real world, whatever that means, it being through politics, high-level politics, then I think we're taking a very narrow view of what peace building looks like. Again, this takes me back to the point about seeing peace building beyond the technocratic lens, beyond the legalistic lens, and towards, okay, how do we manage to make the Truth Commission report digestible for people who have actually experienced war? Because most people in urban settings, unless they have been displaced by violence, they really wouldn't have seen the worst phases of conflict, at least in the Colombian case, but I think we can say this for many other conflicts around the world. How do you get it? How do you get these kinds of people who have actually experienced the worst of conflict to read it, to engage with it, to understand it? That's a challenge that the Truth Commission has faced. And I think every Truth Commission ever has faced. All of them have outreach strategies, but their funding is usually quite constrained. So especially in a country that has a difficult geography, it's extremely difficult to get to certain people. And these people will usually have experienced violence quite a bit. So the Truth Commission did quite a bit to take the report through air, land and sea. Whether it's enough, we don't know, but it's I think it's worth even considering just how much of an effort they did to take it to remote areas around Colombia.
Alejandro, can I feed in at this point a comment that's come in from Martha Giraldo, saying that public policy has to come from us, from civil society. There's no other place possible for a real, sustainable and just society for each one of us, and with our ecosystem, niche, territory, and so on. So just pointing out the way in which everybody's needed for the decisions, promoting the conversations for the transitions while recovering autonomies, both locally and globally. So just a comment that sort of relates to what you've been discussing there. And then if I can then touch on the two comment or questions that have come in. One is from N. Padlovsky, who, as a Canadian First Nations person, talks about knowing what it is to be victimized by church and government over the past few centuries. They're saying there's a lot of talk, but little actual justice or reparation towards Native Americans, not just in Canada. And then Paula Quevedo, if the church had played a role as a perpetrator in the conflict in Colombia, how is the institution or how are members of the church held accountable for such crimes or for complicity with other perpetrators?
There's a number of things there. Do you want to?
Wow, that's a lot of very interesting comments and questions. I think to Ed's question, Native Americans is an extremely difficult realm for transitional justice, or at least contemporary transitional justice. Here, I think we've got a history of 60 years in the Colombian case that we're trying to reckon with and try to address, where we see people who have actually experienced war are alive, they've lost their family members, they've suffered war, but they're here and we can do something about them. We can integrate them into the conversation. What happens when we have descendants of the people who were victimized, or we have people who feel like they've been victimized by structures? That complicates things further, because transitional justice, or the way we think about transitional justice, is dominated by direct violence. Structural violence isn't a legal category that we can accept right now, that transitional justice can accept right now. Whether it's desirable or not that we start accounting for structures of oppression, that's a whole separate conversation that I think the world needs to be having in more serious ways, because we can't just say, we can't just stick to this notion that the only form of violence that is really violence is direct and personal, as Johan Galtung, who recently passed away, talks about. But just to say, I think this is the kind of conversations we should be having as within civil society, within governments, and within international institutions. I don't know if you've got anything to say about this or Paula's question.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I love the fact that you were talking about like structural violence in a sense, because I think that's the key way to understand the way I've been talking about the church and the communities of faith and the negative aspects of their interactions. I mean, it's more about the violent discourses against the bulls and communists in the 60s, or against the LGBTQIA people, or against women, or against members of the same church, especially after the Second Vatican Council. So it's not as easy to point at it. We're not talking about a specific crime. It's more a structural violence sort of contribution. And so I think, answering that question, I think one of the key aspects of the whole process is to have a look at those imaginaries once again, understand if they're still active, and ensure that there are sufficient spaces of conversation being had and being opened, so that they can be assessed and be reviewed by the communities of faith and the rest of the people. I think that's the way to go. And well, I was going to ask you something. I mean, you've been talking about complexifying victimhood narratives. That's basically what you've been suggesting. On my end, it's been about my discourse has been more about broadening, enriching religious imaginaries, understanding where they're coming from, and opening up the conversations that are supposed to be had, especially in civil society. But I was curious to know, in your case, this whole complexifying victimhood narratives, what does it look like in practice?
Oh gosh.
What are you aiming towards?
Well, I think I touched upon it quite a bit in the context of transitional justice, and whether it's possible or desirable that transitional justice does this. I think we do need to rethink quite a bit about the way we do transitional justice to be able to give more space for inclusive narratives, because that's the crux of it. We need to give more space to inclusive narratives and to enrich the narrative landscape of a society. At the end of the day, lasting peace doesn't come with the imposition of one narrative of, this is what happens, and this is what happened. You either accept it, or we don't even want to talk to you, but you have to accept this, because these are the meeting minutes. Transitional justice is that it's the minutes of a meeting. It's a mechanism for settling accounts, and that also brings me back to the question of closure. We want to close that dark chapter. But again, I want to reiterate, I think that's a bad goal. I think transitional justice should be more of a process. I think it should enrich the narrative landscape by opening up spaces for trust building, for solidarity, for empathy, which of course, when you're talking about a conflict that has victimized 9 million people, like the Colombian one, is a gigantic challenge. So I don't think I have a particular answer for you. I think I've got more of an account of the challenges that this involves, but it's really about anything that can open up the space for dialogue and for contestation and negotiation about the past and the future.
Any more comments, questions from around the?
Yeah.
Yes, and then.
With both of you, these religious imaginaries for cultural transformations, do they, or are they sort of going to work in Colombia because it's a similar cultural background, or can these religious imaginaries and these structures that you've talked about be used in other sort of non-cultural, non-theological, homogenous conflicts? I'm thinking about Israel-Palestine in mind. Do you think that this kind of apparatus can work globally?
I think our text will be very different on that. I would focus on the way that religious identities are deployed and weaponized for political purposes. So maybe I'll leave you to answer it in a more satisfactory way for theologians.
That wasn't a very charitable move, but anyway. I suspect it might. But I am very mindful of suggesting absolute formulas in philosophy and in life in general. I think a key aspect of any peace building and conflict resolution situation is to be mindful of local, contextualized understanding. And that's also true even for imaginaries. I mean, when you're trying to understand why and how someone believes whatever it is that they believe, you truly do need to understand that such a map requires, it is coming from a field in particular. It has a specific context. It's aiming to weave together a specific line of territorial elements. There's a motivation behind it. And so complexifying the whole thing, I think, is vital. I have tried as much as possible to come up with a structure, an architecture, an itinerary, a pedagogy, if you will, of how I believe it can be useful to understand how those imaginaries are formed and transformed. And yes, I have applied it specifically in the context of peace building, specifically in Colombia, specifically for religious imaginaries. I think it would be interesting to broaden the perspective and aim and apply it to other imaginaries within the same Truth Commission's report, for example. There are imaginaries that are being pointed at as being problematic. The way we've understood security, for example, has been a huge issue. But I suspect, because I've tried to come up with a philosophical matrix, I do think it has its potential, it has potential to be applied elsewhere. I won't delve into the details of how that might look like for the specific conflict that you brought up, but pending matter. And I will say that as part of the JRF that I'm currently working on, I do want to engage in closer conversations with both peace building practitioners, but also psychologists and people in pedagogy to decant the whole thing, to have a down to earth, much more feasible and clear methodology.
Do you have any thoughts on the particular case you mentioned? I mean, of where religion ends and where politics begins, specifically?
No, which is why I asked.
Fair enough.
Place of liberation theology in that? And
Sorry?
I guess what's the place of liberation theology in that? Because it stops before the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's like the dynamic of coming from Latin America and deeply embedded within Christian theology, but the role it's played in a conflict that is tarnished as being a Jewish and Islamic issue.
I think it's a fascinating topic. I mean, the liberation theology starts in Latin America. It is an effort to sort of contextualize theology in a sense. And you can see how, although it started, I was going to say here, in Latin America. Exactly. Well, you laugh at me. But then as a result of that, there is a number of other forms of theology that have sort of branched out in this effort to sort of decolonize, decentralize, enrich contextually theological efforts. So yeah, I think that's a big deal. Where does religion end and where does politics start, or the other one? I think that's a spicy, difficult question. And to be fully honest, I'm not entirely sure about how relevant it is in theory. You could eventually have interesting theories, but I think it's much more interesting to have down to earth questions in that sense. Like, okay, let's look at this context. Let's look at this religion or this religious imaginary in particular, and see how it goes.
Weaponized, right?
Yeah. No, and in the case of what I could say, Ruel, to your comment is, in the Colombian case, it is, to me at least, fascinating to see how religious elements pop up everywhere. I mean, you have religiously inspired discourses in the far right. You have that in the far left and everywhere in between. And on both levels, if you say, if this is horizontal, vertically as well, you have religious imaginaries being used for peace on both ends and for war on both ends. Yeah. And you have it as pointed at as a device of cultural re-edition. And then once again, you look at the recommendations, and of all the official recommendations, there's a single one directed to communities of faith, and it's this small, and so there's an odd, at least in my reading of the text, although I do value the effort, there is a pending task there. There's something, and I think that's the way it was designed. It's not right to look at transitional justice mechanisms and truth commission reports as formulas that will solve every issue. And so, and they've been very keen to insist on that. And so I linked that with Nico's comment, and I think it's that's where we come in. That's where the next generations come in. Yeah.
You want to say something here?
Yeah, I'm in danger of revealing my ignorance here, but I was curious as to learn how religious imaginaries have been engaged, or whether they have been engaged with by ex-guerrillas and people who were victimized after the end of the peace process in 2016. Not least because it would be very valuable to hear about it, as if there is any possible new peace negotiations in Colombia at some point in its history, or some point in the future, rather.
Sorry, I was being asked a very good question. No, I was going to ask, I mean, are you asking about whether or not religious imaginaries have come up in the experience of people in the aftermath of the negotiations?
Yes.
Former combatants, I suppose.
Oh,
Here it's important to say, though, that the FARC and the ELN as well, they're very secular, or were very secular organizations. So, sorry?
Yeah.
Sorry, no, sorry, I'm talking about the FARC and the dissident groups, Estado Mayor Central and Segunda Marquetalia. Yeah, you're right, ELN is different. Very secular. It's the former demobilized, the demobilized combatants. I don't think I've ever heard of them making references to religion. But that said, the Catholic Church has been hugely influential in promoting peace dialogues, both with the FARC in the past, but also in the current total peace efforts of the Petro government, with the ELN, with the Estado Mayor Central, with the Segunda Marquetalia. They're always there, and the Catholic Church is a very, very influential actor.
It's an important ally there, yeah. I would say that there's been, okay, so before the Truth Commission wrote the actual report, they received more than 10,000 reports from all over the country, from different strands of civil society. So indigenous communities, social-based initiatives, churches, communities of faith. So there are a number of reports there, and I think that was an interesting input to what they were saying regarding these religious imaginaries that I'm discussing. They also got together and heard the testimony of some representatives of various faith communities, the Catholic Church among them, but not just the Catholics. There was also the Mennonites, or indigenous groups and spiritual traditions, yeah. And so because these people were already associated, and they were already working for peace even before the Truth Commission existed, there was an advantage on that side. And so an important part of the Truth Commission has been engaging with them, trying to understand those reports and everything they thought of, and then taking it further. So the Truth Commission has a transmedia service online in which it's sort of uploaded a number of very, very useful resources. That includes a public declaration signed by a number of religious representatives after a meeting in March 2021. And I think I'm bringing it up because it's very, very interesting to see how they not only were committed to reading, understanding, and discussing the report with other people on their own groups, but also making an effort to look within, revise their own imaginaries. They didn't say imaginaries, but that's what they were actually saying, and contribute to peace building in the future. So there is a lot to be done. I'm not entirely sure if there's been a rigorous study of religious components in people's testimonies with the special court, for example, special jurisdiction for peace. That would be amazing, but I haven't heard of it being done.
Maybe a second default.
I'll think about it, Alex. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Any other questions from the floor in the room? Please. Yes. And then Liz.
Maybe we can tie them both, just so that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have a question on the narrative of victimhood. We said that in the recent years there have whitening what a victim is. But this has also on the other side that there is a whitening of who is the perpetrator. So while we have the emphasis on the victim and on the perpetrator, why this is important, and on the peace building aspect of it, the fact that we amplify who a victim is, and this shared trauma, the shared human suffering becoming a unifying factor for peace building.
That's a very, very interesting question. Liz, do you wanna ask your question?
Yes, I'm hovering between two questions, but I think the one I should ask is about imaginaries, because that's not the concept I've ever worked
Across.
with. So it's rather foreign, and I'm wondering which language it originated and so. But would one be right in saying that it's somewhere between a concept and a worldview? So it's a sort of a view about something in particular, with its whole sort of aura around it of images that it might throw up in your mind.
How about I answer Liz's question
Yeah,
and you answer
go ahead.
Papa's question? So yeah, the concept started in sociology, but also in philosophy. Like one of the earliest authors to talk about imaginary was Jean-Paul Sartre. I'm destroying French apologies, but yeah. Then there's also, yeah, exactly. But there's also Cornelius Castoriadis, was half French, half Greek. There's Charles Taylor, who started discussing that as well. And then from that, it sort of started to diversify. I think it's a very interesting concept that started to historically branch out towards the future, but also towards the past. Because nowadays, people discuss imaginaries strongly, closely to Kantian understanding of what imagination is, or even Aristotle's idea of fantasia. So yeah, it does have again like a rich philosophical matrix that is coming from. And regarding what you were asking about its meaning, yes, it could be used halfway between a cosmovision or worldview and something else.
Well, a concept, a simple concept.
Yes.
And a total worldview.
Right. I would say that it does have a conceptual component, but it's not reduced to a conceptual component because it also includes, like I said, the affectively laden side of what concepts entail in people's experience. I think it's a strongly phenomenological concept in terms of philosophy. And yes, in terms of the scope it offers, I like the way you mentioned worldviews, and that's why I was talking about cosmopoiesis, sort of the world building imagination. Catherine Lennon highlights two elements of why she believes they are particularly useful. One is, again, the link with the emotions. So ideas are affectively laden, and that's very strongly linked with contemporary understandings of what embodied cognition means. For example, sort of avoiding bipolar understandings of human beings and the soul or the mind and the body, right? And then the other thing that she comes up with is when you talk about imaginaries, because they're linked with creativity and with free will, you're immediately, yes, opening the door to talking about responsibility, but also the ability to change imaginaries. And so you revisit the possibility of them changing, forming, transforming, adapting.
Thank you.
I got a little bit too absorbed on cosmopoiesis. Can you repeat it?
The question is about, we say we amplify who a victim is,
Yeah.
but this means also the other hand that we amplify who is the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Why it's important, why we concentrate on the victims and on the perpetrators, and this is important for peace building purposes, and whether the shared trauma of all those victims can become the unifying factor on peace building.
Oh gosh, trauma is something I tend to feel a little bit resistant towards the engaging too much with it. Because as a political scientist, again, I care about how these categories are constructed and what you can do with those categories instead of, how are people experiencing this? My departing point is the fact that victims do not become victims just because they feel that they're victims. I can't just say, you know what, I feel like I'm a victim of the Colombian conflict, even though I've never seen violence directly. I just feel like it. You know, you need to be accepted as such by your socio-political surrounding, especially if you add a layer of complexity in a legal mechanism or, you know, public policies that only apply to victims, to recognize victims, and you give them criteria of what you need to, sometimes you need proof to prove you're a victim in certain contexts. How do you prove that? So I think trauma is a separate conversation. But I do have the conviction that feeling represented and feeling like you can see your story and your trauma being acknowledged is productive and conducive to peace. But I'm not telling you that that's going to build peace in itself. But there is significant empirical evidence that tells us that people feel, when they feel represented, they feel like they don't need to, you know, swallow that kind of pain and trauma that they have, and that is conducive towards better social relations, nurture trust, empathy, solidarity with the antagonistic other. And just on the first point that you made, a victim necessarily has a perpetrator. So when you expand the notion of what a victim is, you're also expanding the notion of who the perpetrators are. And again, the thinking of transitional justice is based on assigning blame. No, we care about the victim's rights, we care about the victim's well-being, and most of the transitional justice mechanisms that exist nowadays are centered on the victim. But that also has an element of blame. That also has perhaps not a punitive focus on blame. You know, this trend towards restorative justice is precisely the idea that, okay, you've done this wrong, but we're not going to put you in prison for 20 or 30 years.
It's not about punishing, it's about you making amends.
Exactly. You make amends, and you are an actor that can help restore the social tissue of this society. So I do think when you expand one of them, you automatically expand another one. Of course, one of them has an element of just recognition, another one has an element of investigation. Sometimes, I mean, how are you supposed to tell who the perpetrator of your violence was? Especially when it comes to the large armed groups that acted in particular ways. And perhaps that's one of the problems of the legal foundations of transitional justice, that we want to individualize blame. We want to say, this person is a bad person because they committed this bad thing. But what about, you know, mass instances of violence? What do you do when dealing with a genocide? What do you do, Liz, in South Africa to deal with apartheid, a legacy of structural apartheid, where it was not necessarily bad people doing bad things, but rather a system that got people to act in particular ways? How do you come to terms with that? These are all the dilemmas that people doing transitional justice are facing every day.
I'm afraid I have to say it is now almost 6:30 when we have to bring the formal side of this discussion to an end. I don't know if either of you want to say anything very briefly by way of summing up the discussions. I think it's been a very rich discussion, very beneficial, very enjoyable, as well as beneficial. Is there anything each of you would like to say before we formally close?
I mean, I agree. I think it's been very enriching. I've enjoyed it. I'm glad to hear that you have as well. I think there is an overlap between my interests in my work and what Alejandro has been saying. Of course, we're both interested in peace building in Colombia, but we're looking at a very specific issue, which is the tendency that we have, we human beings, to oversimplify things and to forget that there is a number of nuances and shades and spectrums that we need to bear in mind, especially if we're delving into complex human issues. And so any tools, spaces for discussions, or means that we can have to enrich that conversation and be mindful of those nuances, I think, will be very well received. And I think we've spoken about a few. We've talked about, you know, not explicitly, but we've been highlighting the importance of interdisciplinarity, of broadening perspectives, of not reducing to only legal, only philosophical, only sociological frameworks. And we've also been highlighting the importance of avoiding this violent form of othering that we've described, or even in positive terms, the importance of humanizing or rehumanizing those who are different. Again, this is not about colonizing a space or achieving some sort of ideological, homogeneous situation. It's understanding that plurality and diversity can be good as long as they're framed in the context that avoids violence as a means to solve those differences. That is easier said than done, but yeah, I think that I would say that.
Put me to shame. I don't want to talk about that. No, I think I just want to say stories matter. Stories are politically charged, and the kinds of stories we promote or fail to promote matter in the real world. And let's not just assume that the stories that are told at the highest political levels are the ones that have the most influence. Because stories do impact people's lives, and they impact the way we see ourselves and others. That's, I think, my bottom line. And just to thank everyone for their wonderful participation and everyone online as well.
Yeah, thank
Yes.
you.
And if I could just as a closing comment, again, thank everybody, both in the room and those who joined us online. I apologize to people who haven't got every comment in. I'm sorry about that. But on behalf of everyone, can I thank both of you for a superb presentation and discussion? Thank you.
Thank you.